Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to look at else if and if statements using else if. So first of all, let's set a variable and we'll just call it my time, and let's say this is working off of a 24-hour clock, so we'll start out at 11 a.m. So what I want to do now is I want to check this value and return back, depending on what time it is, I want to return back a different message to the user. So again, we're going to grab in that content, that element there. So using document get element by ID, and that one is output, so that we can output the content into the inner HTML, and we can get rid of this console part here. So I can refresh that, and we see we just got that if statement there. So now we're going to actually do our if statement, and let's check to see if the value of my time, and we know that if it's before noon, then we're going to say morning, and then if it's in the afternoon, we're going to say welcome to the afternoon. So now let's update output, and this is the inner HTML, and we're going to equal that to wake up, it's morning. So let's first try this out, make sure that it's working. So what happens if we come back at 1500 hours and we don't get any type of response? So this is where we can use else, and we can say that else, we can say now it's evening, go to sleep. So we can set some instructions for the user, refresh, it's evening, go to sleep. So we know that depending on what the value of my time is, so if it's really early in the morning, 4 a.m., wake up, it's morning. So hopefully you don't have to get up at 4 a.m., but this is our basic evaluation here of the time. So let's take this one step further. So what if we wanted to add in some additional check to see if maybe we had lunchtime or something like that? So we want to add in some additional checks here. So and with JavaScript, the way that we can do that is we can use the else if statement. And that gives us another option to apply another condition and check to see if this condition is true before we just simply evaluate to the default here, the else. So basically, we're checking to see if this is true, and if it is, then we run the code that's between the curly brackets. Next, we're going to check to see if my time is greater than 12 and my time is less than 1. Then we're going to say output and inner HTML, and we are on a 24-hour clock, so we need to make sure that it's 13. And we'll say go to lunch. So let's refresh this, and we'll update our time. So we'll update our time to be 12.5. So now it's telling us to go to lunch. And we can apply as many else ifs as we want, and make sure that you leave the space in there, because JavaScript, the way that the else if works is that there's no keyword for that. That you do need to make sure that you are providing the spacing in there in order to allow it to accommodate the else if. So we can also add a bunch of other ones if we want to as well. So let's do one more here. So else if, and this time let's check to see if the time is greater than 4 and maybe less than 8, and we'll say dinner time. And let's save that, refresh it, and of course we need to set, and I keep working off of So 4 o'clock would be 1600 hours, and 8 o'clock would be 20 hours. So let's pick a time in between there. So let's do 1700 hours, which should be 5 o'clock. So see that it's dinner time, and everything else, it's evening, go to sleep. So let's do even more here. So we don't want to wake up really early. So now let's update this to accommodate a time, a more reasonable time for getting up. So what I want you to do now is to pause the video and update the code, checking to see if the time is between 8 a.m. and 12, so 800 hours or 1200 hours, and if it is, then we know it's time to wake up. And if it's between 1300 and 1600 hours, then we know that it's time to go to work. So just check to see if it's equal to 1300, so you got to be right on time to work. So 1300 hours, 1 p.m., and you know that it can be up to 1600, and then set the time to 1300 hours, and also update that last statement. So add another else if to see if it's past your bedtime. So checking to see if it's over 2200 hours, and then basically that means that it's time to go to sleep. So make those updates, and I'm going to work through them as well coming up. So pause the video, give it a go, and I'm going to show you how to do that coming up. So we did say that one of the first things that we want to do is add another statement in here. So we're going to check to see if my time is greater than or equal to 8. So we did need to add in those equal signs. And the reason that we're using and is that we want to land it between these different times. So we want to check to see if it's less than or equal to 12, then we know that this is our morning. We got to get up, we got to get going, get to work. So next we know that we've got a lunchtime here. So we're going to check to see if it's greater than or equal to, and less than or equal to 13. And actually I should get rid of this one here. So we know that we're going right away to lunch, and if we're falling between those times, then we know that it's lunchtime. And I also did say that we need to make sure that the user gets to work at 1 p.m. So let's add in a condition for that part. So we're going to check to see if the time is above 1300 or if it's less than equal to 1600. So that's where we can add in that equal sign. And over here we need an equal sign, because if it's 1, then they need to be at work. So this one will tell the user go to work. And then we've got our dinner time, and we needed to add in one more. And I know there's quite a lot of them going on here, and I'm going to show you a better way to do this coming up as well using the switch statement. But for now, let's just stick with our if statement, and we can see that we can add as many as we like, and always checking to see if this condition is evaluating to true. And if it is, then we run the code between the curly brackets, and if it's not, then we just move on to the next statement. So we want to check to see if the time is greater than or equal to 2200, then we know that time to go to sleep, and everything else is you should be sleeping. And now let's do this so there's more of a variable within the my time, and we'll update this to a prompt, and we'll say what hour is it. So now let's refresh this. So it's asking us what hour it is. So let's say it's 8 a.m. in the morning. Wake up, it's morning. Next, let's see that right now it's noon, so time to go to lunch. After that, it's 1 p.m., so 1300 hours. and we always have to be right on time for work. So time to go to work. Next, we know that we've got home from work and roughly around 6 p.m., so 1800 hours, we're going to be eating dinner. Next, let's refresh it, and let's say it's 2300 hours and it's time to go to sleep. And then another one, so let's say it's 3 in the morning, you should be sleeping. So everything looks like it's working great, and in the next lesson, I'm going to show you a better way to create this using the switch statement. So that's coming up. Welcome back, and in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the switch statement. So previously we saw that the if statement allowed us to apply multiple conditions and continue to check, and also have a default that if none of those conditions were true. So this is the same type of idea for the switch statement, but it actually allows you to write it out quite a bit neater. So the switch statement is going to take one expression, and I'm going to use that my time that we're entering in. So my time, and then what it uses is the curly brackets, and it uses the keyword case. So basically this case is what evaluates that expression. So over here we've got a value here, and now let's check case. So our first case, we'll check to see if the value is 8, and if this is true, then we're going to execute some code here. So and I'm going to create a holder for our, so I'm going to just create HTML. I create a variable called HTML, and now I can put HTML and equal that to good more, or we'll just keep it the same as what we did before. We'll do wake up time. And we can add as many things to happen here as needed. And if we want to have another case, so do case 12, and this time the HTML will be lunch, and that should be an equal sign. And next, let's do case, and this time let's do 4 p.m. So that should be 1600 hours, and we'll set our HTML to be dinner. So now let's go down to the bottom, and I'm going to show you that. So the way that we've set it up, it's not actually going to work the first time we run through, and then I'll show you why afterwards. So let's update that with the HTML. So let's refresh, and it's going to ask us what hour it is. So let's say hour 8, and we see that it returns back undefined. And what's happening here is that, first of all, the my time is not a number, so we need to update that to be a number. So update it as a number, go back out, refresh it, and all we get is, oh, we're missing one parenthesis there. So let's refresh that, and now let's try 8. And we see that we get dinner being returned. So the problem here is that what's happening is actually evaluating it as true over here, and then it's continuing through all of these cases. So if, for example, I do something that isn't true, so if I do 5, we're going to just get undefined because we don't have a value being set for HTML. So basically, if one of these expressions, one of these values is true to the expression that we've got in here, then it runs through and it runs the code within the case. And this is where break is really important, because break allows us to stop executing this particular set of code, and this is where we add in break. So we need to add in a break for every single line here, for every single case. Otherwise, if we pick it, it's just going to follow through on to the other cases. So once one of these cases is true, unless you add in break then it will continue to run through the code. So let's try it again now, and this time let's try 8. And wake up time, refresh it again. This time let's try 12, and we see lunch. And this time let's try 16, and we see dinner. And now lastly, let's put something in there that doesn't exist. And we see we get 77. So this isn't an accurate time. We need to have a default, something that says that there's nothing to do for that time. And this is where we can use case. We don't actually have to use case. We can do default. And basically what the default will do is this will add the HTML if none of these are true. So nothing to do, and close that off. So refresh, and now let's do a time that we don't have anything existing, so return back nothing to do. Now, one thing that I do want to note, that we saw that we had to switch this to a number because when we use prompts, we're getting a string value, and that way we need to have them matching types. So we can also see that by default, so this one is my type. And the cases, we can use strings as well. So we don't necessarily need to have numeric values. We can have cases as strings. So let me show you now that if I enter in 8, then it's still going to work because now we've switched it out and we're using the string values. So let's make an update to this. So instead of returning back what we need to do, let's say we enter in what action, what are you doing, and instead of telling us it's time to wake up, depending on the time, we're gonna say what we're doing. So if we're eating lunch, then it should return back that it's 12 o'clock. If we're eating dinner, it should return back that it's 6 p.m. If we're waking up, then it should return back that it's 8 a.m. So what I want you to do now is to open up your editor, make those updates to the switch statement, and try it out and get that output coming into that element on your web page. And I'm going to show you the solution coming up. So I hope you had an opportunity to try it out, and we saw that we can really easily switch and have multiple different types of cases here within the switch statement. And we can also use strings, or we can also use numbers. And if we use numbers, of course, if the case is a number, then we have to also have the switch condition also to be a number as well. So the expression has to match with what the case. So the expression output evaluation has to match to be whatever the case is. So now let's make that update. So we said that we get up. So we know that the time that we get up is going to be 8 a.m. And this one is lunch. So we know that we're eating lunch at 12, and that's 12 p.m. And then dinner, and we're eating dinner at 6 p.m. And lastly, let's do something where not found or something like that. So we get some type of message coming back to the user. So let's try this out. So let's see, what are you doing? Lunch. We see that the time is 12 p.m. We're gonna say dinner. Time is 6 p.m. Refresh it and get up. And make sure that the case matches. And there we go. So we've got it working. And this is how you could use the switch statement. So remember that to include the breaks within the switch statement. Also remember to make sure that the case matches whatever is here within your evaluated expression, and make sure that everything is matching up. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you even more that we can do with the conditional statements, the if statements, and switch statements. So that's coming up. Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to do an exercise. So we're going to flip a coin. We're going to simulate flipping a coin, and we know with a coin it's either heads or tails. So we need to create a prompt asking the user to guess either heads or tails. Then the next step is to evaluate that input from the prompt, because we know that people aren't going to do a 0 or 1. They're going to actually enter in heads or tails. So we have to take that string value, turn it into a number, so knowing that it's either 0 or 1, and then we can use math random, which we saw earlier within the course as well, and generate a random number so that we can simulate throwing the coin and returning back either a 0 or 1. And then lastly, we need to tell the user whether they were correct or not. So let me show you how this is done. And if you want to pause the video, give it a try, write out the code, and I'll show you the solution coming up. So I hope you had the opportunity to try this challenge out. So the first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to ask the question. So this is just going to be question, and of course the variable that you use for the prompt, you could use any one that you wanted. So we'll just do heads or tails. So next, we need to make sure that we can turn this into a number. So let's do something like result. And we can use, there's a number of ways we can do this. So I'm going to use the ternary operator, and I'm going to check to see if, so if question is equal to heads, and if it is, then we're going to return back a value of 1. And it actually doesn't matter, we could do 1 or 0, so it wouldn't really matter the order of these. So this is just basically turning in our question, our verbal question to the user into a numeric format, and then we can use these numbers as a comparison later on. So now we've got our question, it's turned into a numeric result, and next, what we can do is that we can generate a random number. So this will be our random number. And this has to be a number from 0 to 1. So there's only 2 numbers in here. And we're going to use math floor so that we can bring the math value down, so round it down so that it will always be 0 or 1. And now let's do a math random number. So math random is the built-in JavaScript method, and we need to multiply it by 2. So basically that's going to return a value of 0 point whatever, 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 or 1 point whatever, 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 and then the floor is allowing us to round it down. So either a 0 or a 1, that's all that's going to be returned within this statement. And then lastly, we need to actually do our comparison. So we need to check to see if the value of result is equal to the value of random number. And if it is, then let's do something in here. And if it's not, then we can do something else. And then lastly, we can output .inner HTML, and we should create another variable in order to hold our HTML. So I'm just going to call it HTML. I'm going to declare it up there, and then all we need to do is HTML. And maybe over here, I'm going to start out by just saying something went wrong. So hopefully we never see this message, but just in case something went wrong with our condition, and we can just output that something went wrong. So now we know that HTML is, so let me take another look at this code. So we know if the person guessed heads and we're returning back heads, then we see that you guessed correctly. Else we knew you we can say you were wrong. Okay, so now we're ready to give it a go. So let's refresh it. So heads or tails. So let's try it heads, I guess, correctly. And actually, it's going to be a little bit hard to check. We could, of course, we could go into the console here, and this is where we can actually find out what the value. So I believe I guessed heads. Let's see what the value of random number is. And so we see that it's 0. So in order for it to have been right, we know that the random number should have been 1. And then when we do our comparison between the result here and the random number, then we would have been correct. But because it's a 0, we know that we selected heads, which evaluates out to be 1 within the ternary statement there. So we know that 1 does not equal to 0, and we were wrong. And then that's the output there. So that's the solution to this challenge. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you a switch statement, and we're going to build out a magic 8-ball using the switch statement. So that's coming up. Welcome back, and in this exercise, we're going to be using switch. And we're going to create a really nice, interesting magic 8-ball. So basically, it will help us predict what our answer is going to be and what's going to happen in the future. Okay, not really. It's going to just be a random response. So what I want you to do is to create a prompt asking the user to ask their question, and then create a random value where we can return back some kind of random statement to the user using switch. Take the value of that random number and generate a response back to the user, and then output a response back using the question as well as what was responded to. So pause the video, give it a try, and I'm going to show you the solution coming up. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to ask a question, and we saw this earlier that we can do this via the prompt, ask your, or just say ask me anything. So basically this is very open-ended, and we're just asking the user to ask a question, and we're going to create some fun responses that we can send back to the user. So next we needed to create a random number. So let's create a random. And this number, so depending on how many responses we were expecting to do, we can have various random numbers. So if you got really creative, you probably have quite a few random numbers. So for this one, it's always good to decide how many random numbers I'm doing. So let's do random numbers, and let's do 6 different responses. So we're rounding it down. So I'm going to have values coming back anywhere from 0 to 5. So I know that I can apply this within my switch statement. So let's set up switch. And we know that what the value that we want to pass in is random number. So let's pass that value in, and now let's evaluate that and make something happen with it. And we saw earlier that we can set cases. So this one's going to be really straightforward because we're going to have case 0 to 5, and then we'll also have a default case. So also let's do an answer, and for the answer, actually we could, instead of HTML, let's update that to answer. So you could just say something went wrong. And again, hopefully we never see that something went wrong, but just in case, we've got that sitting in there. So for case number 1, let's update answer. So we'll set, so if it's case number 1, then what we're going to do, so this is the action that we're going to do, and we're going to take answer and we're going to equal answer to, so this is where you got to be something creative, and it will work out. And the answers generally in this 8-ball should be very vague because we don't actually know what type of question the user is asking. So we just want to have some type of interesting, generally a funny, maybe provocative response for the users. So next, let's do another one where maybe and maybe not. So this is our response. And then again, don't forget those breaks, because those breaks are really important when you're building out these cases. Otherwise, as we saw earlier, it'll just continue to run through. So next, we'll say probably not. So I'm just trying to think of just some very vague types of responses, and maybe I'll just do one more, and then I'll just leave it up to the default. So I don't want to spend too much time on coming up with some creative answers here. So just so that you get the idea. So highly likely. And we'll break it again. And then lastly, let's do our default. And if we only had, if we had two more, then we generally wouldn't have to do the default. But let's just do one just anyway, just in case. So using the colon again, and this time let's do answer, and this one will be I don't know about that. So again, something very vague so that we can return something back to the user as they get the question. And then lastly, now we just need to output it into our output, and this one is inner HTML. And then let's output. So first of all, let's say you asked me. And then here is the question. And let's do a line break. So do some HTML here because we are using inner HTML. I think that is that. So just leave it at that, and I'm just hoping that my answers do work out. So there we go. So let's give it a shot. So refresh, ask me anything. Is JavaScript going to be around? So to do around in 100 years. Oh, gotta put some spaces in there. So we're gonna say, you asked me, is JavaScript going to be around in 100 years? I think, that should be I think, not I think. I think that I don't know about that. So yeah, we can have a number of different kind of funny responses. And the whole idea is just to have some fun with this and see what different kinds of responses you can generate. So do try it out for yourself. Create some interesting creative responses. Try to make them as generic enough so that whatever the user is asking, essentially, we can respond back and have a fairly funny response back for the user, entertaining response back to the user using switch and a number of the other JavaScript that we've learned earlier.
In this section, we're going to be building out a rock, paper, scissors game, and this is predominantly going to use conditions. And it's going to really allow you to put into practice what we've learned in the previous lessons. So first of all, let's set up our application. We're going to, first off, we're going to ask a question, and this is going to be from the player. We're going to use prompt, and we're going to ask them, do you choose, so rock, paper, or scissors? So that's going to be the first question that we're going to ask the player. So coming in when it loads, and let me reload the page. So there we go. So we've got our question, and as we saw earlier, those values are going to be stored within player. So the next thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to set up another variable, and this is going to be whether the player is going to win. So it's just basically a Boolean value that we can use as a placeholder that we can access when we apply our conditions. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the game rock, paper, scissors, so basically there's 3 options and one option always trumps the other option. So if you pick rock, then and the other player picks paper, then the paper essentially covers the rock and that player wins. Rock beats scissors, scissors beat paper, paper beats rock, in that order. So there's always one choice that will beat another one, or you could end up with a tie. And that's why this is ideal. This is an ideal game for conditions, because we've got a lot of conditions that we need to check and see if they're met. So let's set up our computer. So this is our computer player, and he's going to have a selection as well. So we know that there's 3 options. So we need to get a random value, and we need to divide it by 3. So let's do math and random. And we saw earlier that we could multiply it by 3 and we can get the 1 to 3. So that's one way of doing it. But let's just leave math random. And this time we're going to do this all with conditions. And we know that math random by default provides a number from 0 dot and a whole bunch of decimal placed numbers. So, and the way that we were using it before is we were multiplying in order to get a value. So this time what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the value that the computer selected is less than 0.34. So we know that that number is going to be a third. So 1 in 3 chance of having the number less than 0.34. And if it is, then we're just going to reuse that value for the computer, and we're going to set it to one of the 3. So let's start out with rock. So basically, if it's less than 0.34, the computer is going to have a rock. And now we need to add in the additional conditions to see if the computer has less than 0.67, and then otherwise it's going to be the third option. So what I want you to do now, pause the video and add in the rest of the 2 choices within this conditional statement. So basically what we want is we want a 1 in 3 chance of it being either rock, paper, or scissors. And go ahead and pause the video and add that into the code, and I'll show you the solution coming up. So I hope you had an opportunity to try that out. And as we saw earlier, we've got conditional statements, so we can ask another question. We can say if computer is, so if this one is true, then the computer is going to be equal to rock, and computer is going to be overwritten, and this is going to be no longer available to be true. So the next option is, let's go 6, 7, and if it's falling within 6, 7, then we're going to set the value of computer to paper. And then finally, if none of those are true, we know that we can set the value of computer to the last value. So basically, we have a 1 in 3 chance of selecting one of these, each of one of these values. So let's make sure that this is working out. We'll output it into the console, so computer, and save that, refresh, and we see that we need to make our choice. So let's do rock, and we see that computer gets rock as well. So it doesn't matter how many times. I'm actually going to disable this for now, and I'll just show you. I'm just going to refresh it a bunch of times, and we can see that we're getting all 3 different entries. So all I'm doing is just refreshing, and if you look down here in the console, we're making one of the selections, so it's either rock, paper, or scissor, and there's roughly a 1 in 3 chance for each one of those. So that really is the basic functionality of the game, and now we're ready to go to check to see who the winner is. So we've got our players selection, we've got our computers selection, and now last but not least, we need to make sure we do a final check to see if the player wins or if the computer wins. So I want to introduce you to a string method, and this is going to be useful when we're building out this application. And what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to select that first character. So if we do character at and we specify which position we want to return the character from whatever is selected in computer. Remember, it's scissors. So let's say we want that S. We can see that we can return back the first character within any string by using character at and then specifying whatever character we want to return back. So if we want the second one or the third one, then we would just need to indicate that. And we are going to look at more at string methods later on in this course as well, but I just want to introduce this because I want to also pull out that first character from the user's response, so allowing them to either do R, P, or S to be shorter so they don't always have to type in the full value. And there's another reason too that I want to grab that first character and do a comparison of the first characters, and that's because I also want to transform this to uppercase. So if, for instance, our character is not uppercase, we can transform it to uppercase by using a built-in string method called toUpperCase. And basically what this will do is this will transform any character to uppercase. And we can also do lowercase. And of course, we are going to look at this in more depth later on within the course. But basically, this allows us to transform to uppercase or to lowercase. And this is also really important because when we're applying our condition, we don't want to have to account for if the player's done lowercase, if they've done uppercase. So we don't want it to be case sensitive. We just want to be able to match that if it's R or rock, and if the computer has rock, then we know that it's a tie, and so on. So let's set up some more values here, and I'm going to take that player value and I'm going to transform it to uppercase. So this is the player's selection, so we'll just do PS for short, and we're going to take player and we're going to use with what we just saw, so character at and position 0, and we're going to also transform it to uppercase. And we're going to use PS and we're going to compare it to the computer selection. So let's set up computer selection. So variable computer selection, and this one is going to use computer character at position 0, and it's also going to transform it to uppercase. So it doesn't actually matter whether it's the player's entered in lowercase or uppercase, it's going to transform them. So this is where we need to start looking at how we can tell if the player won or if the computer won. And this is where we're going to use our conditional statements and take what we've learned earlier. And it's a great exercise in applying this logic. So what I want you to do now is to try it out, and I'm going to show you the solution coming up in the next lesson. So the first one that we need to look at is we need to check if it's a tie. So compare PS to CS and see if they're equal. And if they are equal, then we know that it's a tie. And else, so if they're not equal, then we know that one player won and one player lost, and we need to be able to determine that, and we can do that with conditions. So the first line would be comparing CS to PS, and then the next one be checking if PS is a rock, and if it is, then we check to see if CS did scissors, and then we know that the player wins. So we're going to be doing all of the conditions and checking to see if the player wins, and if the player does win, then we're going to transform win to true, and that's how we're going to know that if the player won or lost at the end of all of those conditions. So that's coming up in the next lesson. And one more thing before we finish up this lesson. So I just spotted an error. So both of these are actually methods. So we got to make sure that we use the rounded brackets at the end of those uppercase. So make sure that we save it, try it out, and we know that right now we can enter that in. So I'm going to see PS, so we're getting it as R, CS as S. So now you can go ahead and make those comparisons of PS and CS to see if they match. In the upcoming lesson, I'm going to show you the solution. And we're going to work out all of the logic to determine who won and who lost in this game of rock, paper, scissors. So I hope you had an opportunity to try this out. Now the first thing that we needed to do is add in the ability to output. So we saw this before where we grabbed that element, and now we can output content into here. So now let's add in the condition. So we know that we can check the value of CS, and see if it's equal to PS. So CS is the computer selection, PS is the player selection, and if they're actually equal, then we know that this is a tie. So I want to have a variable as basically a placeholder. It's going to start out as blank, and this is where I'm going to add in that it's a tie. And we're also going to indicate if the player is a winner or a loser. So it's a tie. That's what we're going to add into that HTML. So we know that if CS is not equal to PS, we've got a lot of conditions to work out. So let's try that out. And we know that we can add that into that else statement. And then at the end of the day, we're going to do output.inner HTML is equal to, so it's going to be player versus computer. And I know there's a lot of styling that you could add into this as well. So feel free to update this with styling. I'm just doing some really basic HTML here. I'm not going to worry too much about the styling for this one. This is just a simple exercise to demonstrate how we're outputting and doing the rock, paper, scissors. So do player. So I just want to be able to output that content. So I've got the player's content. I've got the computer's content. So let's output that for display. Make a line break there. And then last but not least, let's add in what happened, the result. So basically, this result is going to be what happened after we run all of our conditions. So we can try this out and we can refresh it. So let's do rock and hit OK. So rock versus rock, it's a tie. So that one actually worked, and that was a nice fluke there that both the computer and myself picked the same one. But this isn't going to be always the case, so we need to make some conditions. So let's add these in. So what I want you to do is to really think about the logic of this application, and we can really do this within conditions. So let's start out with the very basics. We know that the player's selection. So the player selected either rock, paper, or scissors. So it's going to be displayed within PS as R, P, or S. And I really like typing scissors. That's why having these first characters is going to be really ideal. So PS, and we're going to check to see if the player has selected a rock. And if they have, then we know that the rock beats the scissors, and we know that that's how the player is going to win. And if the computer hasn't selected scissors, let's say we know that the computer hasn't selected rock either, because we've done that condition over here. So there's only one other option. So if it's not scissors, then it's paper. And if it's paper, then the computer wins. But we've already set this to false, so we don't have to worry about that one. So let's do our condition. We'll check to see if the player's selection is rock. And we're also going to have a condition in here to check to see if the computer selection is equal to scissors. And we know that if this is true, then the player wins. So we just need to set that to true. We know that if the player selects rock and the computer selects scissors, then the player wins. So let's add in some additional conditions here. So we're going to check next, going through some of the other possible options, and we're going to see if the player's selection, and the order of these actually doesn't matter. So player selection is paper. We could have just as easily chose scissors. So what I want you to do now is pause the video and update the rest of these conditions. So we know that paper, and if the computer has selected rock, that means that we won. And so we can do the same type of statement there. And then last but not least, we know that there's only one other option, and that's the player selected scissors, and then we can do those conditions as well. So take a minute, try it out, and I'll show you the solution coming up. So hope you had an opportunity to try that out. So we know that if the player selects paper and the computer selects rock, that means that the player won. So that's one we can include there. And one more. So there's one more possibility, and this one is just going to be the last default. We know that the player selected scissors, so we don't have to do any other condition there for the player. And here we just need to check to see what the computer has selected. So if the player selected scissors and the computer's selected paper, and we know that scissors cut paper, so that turns out to be true as well. So now we've got all of our conditions. We know that if the win is true or false. So we need to add in one last condition check here, and that's to see what the value of win is. And if win is true, so if any one of these conditions were met, it's going to set win to true, and basically meaning that player wins. And we also know that if the player didn't win, else, we know that the HTML is that the computer wins. So if the player doesn't win, then, and if it's not a tie game, then basically that means that the computer wins. So I think we're ready to try this out. So let's refresh, make our selections. So let's do rock, hit OK. So we've got player versus computer, rock versus scissor. Result, player wins, because we know that the rock crushes the scissors. Let's try that one more time. So let's do paper. And we've got paper versus paper, so the result, it's a tie. So one last thing that I did want to add in, and that means that if, for instance, we do S versus rock, so we know that the computations are still going to work out, that this is scissors versus rock, and we know that the rock crushes the scissors, but we're not actually outputting scissors, we're just outputting S. So let's update that within the conditional statements so that we can actually have those full values. So I want you to do now, again, pause the video and add that part in. So make sure that even if the user or the player selects only the first character, that we're still good and that we can still write out either rock, paper, or scissors. So go ahead and try that out, and I'll show you the solution. So the solution for that is that we can overwrite the value of player. So we know that if we've done our condition check here, we've checked to see if the player's selection is rock. So we know that even if the player had typed in rock or if they typed in R, then the player should always equal rock because that's the actual selection that was made. Next, we can do the same thing for here. So the player can equal to paper. And then last but not least, the player can equal to scissors. So I'm going to just clean that up a little bit there. And let's write out scissors. And then we should be ready to try this out. So now let's refresh. And instead of scissors, I'm just going to put S. And I think I got to save that. So I think I didn't save that properly. So let's try that out again. So now we've got scissors versus paper, result, player wins. So now we're all ready to go with just the first character. So we don't always have to have the user type in the full rock, paper, or scissors. They can just pick the first character. So now it's up to you to take the code, try it out for yourself, make some updates to it. You can make it look a whole lot better by adding in some styling. And as well, in the upcoming lessons, when we're going to look at functions, and we're going to look more at what we can do with the DOM. That's going to open up the door to a whole lot more possibilities with the source code. And as within the other exercises, as you learn more JavaScript, you can always come back, make some updates to the code, and really customize it and really build it out. So go ahead and try this out for yourself within your own editor and see what you can make happen with rock, paper, scissors, the game.